All right, everybody. Thanks for joining me on another episode of the Financial Pathway podcast. I've got Brian Nall here with me. I've been looking forward to our conversation, Brian. Brian, why don't you take a second, introduce yourself, and then I'll kind of say a word about how we connected and why I wanted to have you on the podcast.
Sure, yeah, happy to do it. I'm Brian Nall. I'm the executive director of the Pensacola Bay Baptist Association here in Pensacola, Florida. So that's my role, and I'm coordinating the network of Southern Baptist churches all throughout Escambia County. That, of course, includes Pensacola, and then even consulting with several other associations in the Panhandle as well.
Yes. So this is a relatively new world for me. Olive Baptist Church, where I go, is a Southern Baptist church. I grew up in an independent Baptist church, so a lot of the functions and I don't know, not quirks, but just the ways that Southern Baptist churches operate, a lot of that's been newer for me. So Brian, you and I met, and I didn't even realize this. I kind of put two and two together when we came to Olive several years ago and wanted to join the church. We went to the Next Steps table in the lobby, and it was you who helped us, because I remember the conversation and you were telling us, I don't actually, like, I'm at different churches almost every week. I just happen to be at Olive today and I help. And so you were telling us a little bit, and at the time I didn't get it. I was like, okay, that's cool, I guess. And then it wasn't until a few years later that we were able to reconnect and learn a little bit more about what Pensacola Bay Baptist Association does and its role. So why don't you unpack that for us a little bit? Most people are familiar with, okay, the Southern Baptist Convention, national organization, all these churches that belong to it, but what is Pensacola Bay Baptist Association? How does that fit in that picture?
Sure, yeah, no, appreciate the opportunity. Hey, and mention it's interesting on the Next Step table. That was the only day I've actually been able to ever do that in all the years.
Oh, really?
So yeah, that was like the only opportunity. I think it was like an Easter or somewhere around there. So they said, hey, could you help out? I happened to be there. It's like, sure. So you're like my only one ever in all the years I've had
I
the
feel very
conversation
privileged
with.
now.
Yeah. So no, here's kind of unpacked on that whole world is Southern Baptist Convention. You have right now there's about 47,000 Southern Baptist churches, and those are 47,000 really autonomous, independent, self-sustaining, self-governing churches. Then those separate churches say we want to cooperate together, and there's three levels of cooperation that they choose to partner with. They choose to partner locally, and that's with the local association. Often it's around a county, but some areas of the country, it might be a couple counties. And there's about 1,100 associations throughout the entire United States. And then they also want to partner in a state level, or if it's a small state, sometimes there's a couple states that unite together in a convention. And there are 42 state conventions throughout the United States. And then there is the national partnerships. And through the national partnerships, there's 11 different entities that kind of help facilitate the various national cooperation ministries on different items. Those are 6 seminaries scattered throughout the United States, our North American Mission Board that helps with church planting, some evangelism training resources, some chaplaincy. Our part of that is our Sin Relief, that is our national and international benevolent compassion arm ministry. There's also the International Mission Board that we deploy thousands of missionaries around the world. We also have Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission that's advocating Christian values into Washington and those policies. And then there's that administrative role, that's the executive committee that helps to make a little bit of cooperative guidance between our annual meetings that happens usually every June. But there's the hierarchy. Sometimes that can be confusing when you think to other denominations. Really, there is the only hierarchy is that the local church is the top of the food chain. State conventions, national conventions, and even our local associations. They do not govern over. So even as the local association, I don't govern over my 60 churches here in Escambia County. The state convention doesn't govern over all those throughout the state, and that's the same way it is nationally. It's just, hey, every church we're independent, we're autonomous, but we choose to partner together on some theological endeavors like seminary and some missional opportunities locally and throughout the United States. So that's your kind of a nutshell how that works.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And I'm glad you emphasized churches are autonomous. Every church that's
Mhm.
in the association in the Southern Baptist Convention, it's an autonomous church.
Correct.
Um, and it's a cooperative thing. So really it's not the association or the state convention like over top.
Mhm.
It's churches at the top. So
It
because
is.
right, it would be very easy, I think, for people to assume it would be like maybe a Presbyterian or Lutheran or any other denomination that has a hierarchical structure of, kind of up the food chain, so to speak. So you
Mhm.
mentioned there's 60 churches in your association. Give us a
Right.
flavor. What do we have in those 60 churches? A lot of differences, right?
Sure. Yeah, there is. So we'll have churches that just started in the last couple of years and others that have been around. I think my oldest, actually First Baptist Pensacola, 1847 was really is our oldest. We have churches of a couple dozen people, and then others of a few thousand people. We have African American churches, Hispanic churches, a Burmese church, Korean church, and churches from that are down on the beach and those that are up in the farmland rural. And then, of course, right there in the middle is I-10, just cuts right through the middle of Escambia County. And so then there's that transient nature. So that's really the flavor. We break everything up in some ministry zones based off our county commissioner districts, so for some extra strategic ministry partnerships. But yeah, it's from larger mega churches to small rural churches, um, just really promotes all the different cultures that are reflected within Escambia County.
Right. Yeah. And for those that I know many people listening to the podcast are familiar with Pensacola. Those that are not, I mean, Pensacola, even though we're Florida, it's the panhandle. So culturally, it really is the deep South.
Right.
As far as like ethnic diversity, not nearly as much as what you would have in the Northeast or West Coast. So that context makes it different. So sometimes, I talk to people, I say, yeah, I'm in Pensacola, Florida, and they're picturing with Tampa or Miami, right?
Sure.
So we're much more like Alabama than we would be, what people think of when you think of Florida.
It is. You're really more to about 60% Anglo, 20% African American, and then about 6% both when you get to Asian and 6% also Hispanic,
Mm,
and then a couple other ethnicities involved as well. And so yeah, that's just the framework here. Plus, what's nice here is from all of those backgrounds too, we have a big military presence. So we know that's part. There's the rural farmland and tourists, but also military. We got about probably from where I'm sitting right here, you go not even an hour, probably to about 5 military installations, home of the Blue Angels, plus we got our beaches and some cotton fields all in that area.
right. Yes. Yeah. It is a very interesting mix. And yeah, I think as I've talked to people, yeah, there's a lot of people that because of the military have been brought into this area. Yeah, I used to be
Mhm.
stationed at NAS Pensacola and now, 20 years ago, and then we moved back here. And so you have sort of that transience of people here going and yeah, especially within Pensacola, that is very common. So let's talk a little bit about how the association supports the churches in this area. Like what is, because there's certain things that are done at this convention level, certain things that are at the state level, but what is the local association? What are the areas that you're doing or things that you're doing to support the church?
Sure, yeah. Our ministry really is for the health of the local church. Churches individually, that's like we want to give towards the association and towards our ministry and our mission and our efforts. But our ministry and our mission and our efforts is back towards the local church for them to accomplish their kingdom mission. That's really where our heart is for churches to be as strong as possible to fulfill the biblical mission that God has given them. So we like to even think of it in maybe the example of when Sir Edmund Hillary climbed Mount Everest. Nobody really remembers the name of Tenzing Norgay. That was the Sherpa. That was the guy that helped him on the journey. And as the association, we're kind of that Sherpa. We're there to kind of provide the resources, the guidance, the help, the encouragement to help each of our pastors and churches as they fulfill that kingdom journey that God's given them and their church, whatever that context is. And the way we pursue that is really in three main areas. It's our encourage ministry, our equip ministry, and our engage ministry. So in our encourage ministry, that is my ministry to our pastors. I get to be, it's one of those privileges. I've been pastoring a long time before in this role. And so I get to be a type of pastor to our pastors, encouraging them, making sure them, their families, their kids are taken care of. All because pastors, it can be very tough, sometimes isolating. And I want to be that voice, that sounding box for them. So we have a ministry to our pastors. And then we also have under our encouragement ministry, pastor to other pastors. So that's just helping them set up battle buddies so they have somebody to talk to, vent to, share to, help hold each other accountable. And then there's our church to pastor. So we actually train our churches. How do you care for your pastor? Especially in those areas that's really awkward for the pastor to talk about. So we'll train a church on how do you properly pay for a pastor, compensation issues, sabbatical issues, just how do you rightly relate to the pastor's wife, pastor's kids. So we want to make sure that past churches are rightly trained to care well. And we'll do that from even when a church is looking for a new pastor, we'll train search teams. We will help them vet, we'll help onboard that new pastor and making sure that pastor and church is set up for a great ministry. Our equip ministry, that's really all about church health. We are in 3 different areas of that. We help churches diagnose their church health, and we have some metrics and frameworks to go about doing that. Then whatever those areas of need that a unique church has, we'll help them develop customizable strategies for whatever that might be. And again, that might be a range from an evangelism need that they have. They feel they really need to kind of crank up their evangelism efforts. And so we'll come alongside them, help them there. To all the way, it might be they need to relook at their insurance for their facility or something with their building or everything in between. And then the last part is that deploying. We'll come alongside and coach them, whatever strategy they've identified or ministry need. We'll just walk alongside them and coach them towards that direction. And then the final component is engage. And that is our prayer ministry, gospel proclamation, and church planting. So we know we're always need to be moving forward at the speed of prayer. And we want to just help churches have that vibrant prayer ministry. We also want to make sure the gospel is going out through our churches, make sure they have resources for gospel conversations. And whether that's tracts or Bibles or just customizable evangelism strategies for the demographics around their communities, or we even work with county offices such as code enforcement. If somebody might be ticketed, they'll actually call us and I'll find the nearest church. And then that church will go out for a local mission project and do a ministry engagement with that individual. So we try to be a connector for gospel conversations. And then the last is church planting. We sought to kind of identify where some additional churches are needed, because though there's a good number of churches throughout our county, the growth of our county, we know that there's still more churches that are needed, and we've sought to identify which zip codes needs a little bit more gospel presence. So it's both more healthy churches and then more healthy churches when we go through revitalization and church planting. So that's the flow that we come. And then the only extra direct ministry we have, I do have a counseling ministry here. It's Faith and Hope Counseling. So we have about 20 counselors on our staff that it's a backup for our churches, as well as a direct service to the community to provide licensed clinical Christian counseling to anybody that needs it.
Yeah, that's huge. And I think that's a very much a growing need. There was, I think, a stigma not too far back in the past as far as counseling, what all that entailed, and people's willingness to seek out counseling. But whether that's, I'm sure, for pastors as they're talking to members that need counseling, but also for pastors themselves a lot of times to receive some of that counsel and have a way to go to somebody to kind of have that confidentiality and that support. Mm-hmm. I think that's huge. So like that whole breakdown of like the concierge service that the that the association is that provides, I think that's really, really good, because there's a lot of things you covered in just a short amount of time. Can you share a couple of examples? I know you came to our church a few weeks ago and kind of shared with some of us some of the different things that the association does. Share with us a couple of examples from COVID and then abuse within the church, some different things that you've been able to share with churches as far as policies and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So there's always new items that pop up in ministry. People are involved. We live in a broke world, and that's morally, and also there's just diseases and stuff that affect all of us. So we want to make sure churches are still able to accomplish kingdom ministry. One of my favorite verses is everything done in a fitting and orderly way. So if we can have some healthy policies and guidelines for whatever that church may be, we want to help provide those churches with those parameters. And so a couple of different ways. When COVID was happening, I was trying to track what government guidelines were for spacing and for seating, and a lot of those different administration stuff that was kind of seemed to be changing every few hours at the beginning and then every few days. And so knowing the context of our churches, I would take those guidelines or executive order that came down, and we'll put that into some coaching questions, some guidelines for our pastors, and send that to all those guys so they could be calculating, okay, if we're going to have these ministries, how many people based off our church sanctuary do we need to seat? Do we need to go to 2 services? Do we go to 3? How do we organize for bulletins? So we would come with a whole bunch of coaching parameters that it didn't really matter if it was a church of 30 or 3,000. We're able to take those coaching questions that we translated the policies and just put them into some practical guidelines to help them navigate through COVID and all those decisions that were coming. And then even if needed, we'd go into churches, maybe they didn't have the technology to record. And so we would help them with those resources, know how to record or set up YouTube pages or Facebook pages, train them how to do that, maybe build websites for our churches to help them kind of navigate many who are just stepping into getting a digital footprint. We did similar things, like we have hurricanes around here, so we'll make sure I try to stay in contact with local weather and emergency management stuff, send information out to our pastors so they can make wise ministry decisions as they need to, as we can get impacted in different ways. Of course, if you're living in a rural, if you're living down on the beach, but we just want to keep our guys in the loop as they're making ministry decisions. And also for abuse, that has been a hot button item, a prominent national topic within the whole Southern Baptist Convention. And while churches had guidelines for how are we going to handle internally, the Southern Baptist Convention as a broad mechanism, just that national, didn't have all those mechanisms in place because, like I mentioned at the very beginning, we're 47,000 autonomous churches, so there's not really this hierarchical mechanism between the two. So they're trying to think through what does that new relationship look like to maintain national cooperation, yet autonomy for the local church. So they're now thinking through all those things. But regardless of what that relationship looks like and those mechanisms, we want to make sure that our local churches have just wise policies in place. So I'll come alongside a church, look at whatever they have, help them tweak, rewrite, review, or even just help them write afresh to make sure they have good guidelines in place. And again, some of those policies, they expand and contract based off the size of the church, the context of the church, and we'll help them kind of tailor in what that resource looks like so they're able to minister their church in a safe, biblical way, so they care well for the people in their church and also the community that they engage.
Yeah, that's huge. That's huge. I think there can be a lot of frustration and ambiguity on the part of a church when they're like, how do we, we need to have a coherent policy with how we deal with issues of abuse or how we're going to handle COVID and like all of these things. So to have a resource and somebody that's staying on the front lines of those issues, distilling them, and then communicating them effectively and giving some guidelines, not like here's exactly what you have to do, but rather here are the main points and here are some things that you want to consider. I think that's extremely valuable. So when people pick up the phone and they call PBBA or they call Brian Nall,
Right.
what are the common issues that prompt a church to want to reach out to you in the association?
Sure. Boy, it's no 2 days are alike. That's for sure. Often there can be, as whenever people get together, that we still can drag along the self and the flesh and sin in our life. And so that can create some contention at times within any church, and they want to handle it biblically and rightly. And so sometimes an outside voice is needed. And so there are times I'll come and I'll help just be a outside voice, sometimes just doing mediation for helping conflict management. So that's one issue that I can facilitate within our churches. We also come, again, as mentioned earlier, when there's pastor transitions, we'll make sure a church is trained for that. A lot of our items recently has been in some organizational areas. We'll come and a church may be missing a key document, or they really need to take a fresh look at, hey, maybe their budget is disordered. It doesn't reflect their mission, or there's some glaring areas that it didn't see. So I've been helping churches write missionally aligned budgets. We've been helping them rewrite and look at bylaws because maybe it hadn't been looked at in 30 years. And so we just want to help them have some guidelines so they can take that before their church for them to approval or whatever their affirmation process in their church may be. A lot of our stuff is, hey, Brian, we think we're going through a struggling time. Can you help us pinpoint what that is? And so in my encourage ministry, as I'm regularly just checking in on the guys, how's it going? How can I serve you, pray for you, help your church in any way? They may mention a challenge, and we will come and say, hey, let me do a deep dive with your church. And so we'll walk that church through some diagnostics. We have the overall framework, which is 12 characteristics of a healthy church, because we've been pursuing as our vision is we've been calling it Moonshot 2030. It's 100 healthy churches together that can celebrate 2,000 baptisms in the year 2030. Well, part of that, we wanted to put some handles on what is a healthy church, because everybody just kind of has their own, almost like nailing Jello to a wall, what that looks like. It's this emotional goal. But we wanted to put some handles on it so some churches could look towards as a metric. So we put together 12 characteristics of a healthy church with some help from metrics. And then we'll use an assessment, a couple, actually have about 3 that we'll walk through with the church and then help them get a gauge of where they're at. And then from there, they can, oh, we're weak in this area, we're weak in that. Oh, I didn't know we had a trend. Some churches, especially through COVID, they will, maybe they didn't realize we have actually declined this percentage for a number of years. We didn't know it. And then we can help them identify those areas, kind of like if a light goes out in your car, all that light comes on. Okay, what's that code connected to? We just want to help churches identify those areas of concern and then come back and help them make the corrections they feel God's leading them to make.
Yeah, I love that. It's right. So you're operating, you're the 411 for information, but you're also the 911 for some of those emergency needs. And so, right, I can certainly understand that there's lots of different issues and no 2 days being alike. I'm glad you mentioned the 12 characteristics, because when you were talking to us a few weeks ago, I think that was the thing more than anything else that stood out to me as being just such a helpful service for churches, because when you're in a church, whether you're a pastor or a member, you have blind spots. It's just human nature. There's going to be things that you just don't see. You know, churches are like, we're a friendly church. Well, you think you're a friendly church because you already know everybody there and everybody's friendly to you, but do you really know what a visitor's perspective is? And so all these things, having somebody that's from the outside, that's a little bit more objective in their evaluation and has actual assessment guidelines, not just sort of arbitrary, like, well, what do you think? Oh, I think we're a B+ in that area. Well, what does that mean? Based on what? So yeah, not that we want to be formulaic in what it takes to be a healthy church. As long as you hit these 3 key numbers, then you're a healthy church. But there is a little bit of a give and take. I have here, because you shared with us some of the materials that you have. I have here the card with the 12 characteristics of a healthy church. I won't read all of them, but I did want to kind of hone in on a few of them. Like, for instance, one of them is 10-to-1 gospel conversations, 10 gospel conversations per year for every weekly attender. I feel like that's a pretty, for a lot of churches, that's a pretty lofty goal. I think it's a great goal, but it's something that probably a lot of churches are woefully behind on. 60% connection, minimum of 60% of church attenders involved in discipleship context, either one-on-one, cohort, small group. Pastor accountability and coaching. This is really needed. And I think probably within the Southern Baptist context, a lot easier to provide this because the cooperation is already kind of baked in. But for a church that truly is independent or autonomous, who's the accountability? Who's the battle buddy or pastor? Who's the person that can speak into their life in a personal way that they share those details with, that they can't share with just anybody? And then also the 40 to 1 ratio, $40, and that's weekly, correct? $40 a week for every one adult in the church. So you have 100 adults attending a week, $4,000 in giving per week.
Yeah, that gets to per capita giving. So I'll just start there. And we can kind of backtrack from it. That gets to per capita giving. So the way you can calculate what your church's per capita giving is take all the undesignated receipts a church may get in a given year, divide that by the number of adults, 18 and up, not students, not kids, and then divide that number by 52, and that'll get your per capita giving. It is a metric. It's not the only evaluation of a church's health by any means, but it is a metric because as that number goes up, what you're beginning to see is who the adults that are coming. So those families that are coming, they're willing to invest more of their family dollars into that kingdom mission. And then if that number really starts going down, you start to see not people aren't investing as much. Sometimes you'll see that trends over time. And so even there is some fluctuation based off the average demographic age of the church. If you've got a church that there might be 70% of the church is an older generation, there's more natural bent for them to be higher givers, just the way they're growing up. So you're aware of that. So that's why it's not the only indicator, but it is a measure of investment. We put that number with the $40 because with some national surveys that have been taking place from some great organizations, that's about the average number that you see in there across all, just pretty much all the United States is around that 40 is the average. So just picking that as a middle, when you begin to drop down on the national average, kind of below average per capita giving, above that you see increase in per capita giving. So that's a metric. And if you see a trend line going down, we say, hey, let's consider what does a stewardship look like? Is there adjustments in the way you communicate this to your church on giving? You need some training on giving, online giving, other platforms, or let's just teach what Scripture says faithfully about giving. Since Jesus taught on it, we don't need to worry about not teaching on it. Let's follow his example. So we'll look at that number as an indicator. When we come back for, let's just say that pastor relationships, it is really easy for pastors to be isolated. Just the nature of pastors, you can be always on guard. You don't know who in your church around. Can you just let your guard down just to be you? And sadly, we continually see just national stories, local stories of some pastor that made a really poor moral decisions. Many pastors, they don't hit the headlines when there's some competency issue. It is often those moral issues. And Scripture is clear. We need to have somebody that's just sharpening us. Iron sharpens iron. So we want to encourage as much as we can to say, Pastor, who do you have in your life that you can have those hard conversations with? It may be a local guy that you're able to meet with. It may be a friend that you've had for years across the country, and what's y'all's framework for to connecting with each other. And so what we do, we just seek to know in our guys, what's the first name of your battle buddy? And then we also provide some just sample questions that you can ask to whoever your battle buddy is to hold accountability to each other. And we're so whenever we have an E-team, which is our encouraged team, so I'm just a group of 6 pastors. Each of them have a little care group list. They'll text their pastors, encouraging them as well, in addition to what I'm doing. And they can just say, hey, how's it going with your battle buddy? Again, we don't need to know any of the conversations that they're having. That's all private and confidential. But we do want to really push to make sure no pastors are feeling isolated, because really some dumb decisions often follow isolation. And we want to prevent our pastors from that isolation. So that's why we encourage that biblical accountability to take place for the pastor. And also even accountability and discipline that needs to go beyond them into the local church. Sometimes we don't always think of that role. Sometimes we can kind of be very consumeristic in our churches, but scripture is very clear. We need to rebuke, correct, as well as we're training towards righteousness. So we'll come and we'll help churches to make sure their documents reflect just good church discipline items. And then just make sure that's even between churches, we have some documents that we've set up. So pastors are saying, here's how we want to relate to each other as pastors across town. Because let's just say somebody in church A was just engaged in some sinful behavior that warranted church discipline and their church. And so a pastor needed to respond wisely. Well, that individual may not like that biblical pastoral correction. So they just leave the church and they go across town to another church. Well, there's still sin out there. And since you're just transporting sin from one area to another and it's not resolved, the kingdom is not healthier. So we just have some pastoral covenants, responsibilities. Just, hey, somebody comes from another church, I'm going to pick up the phone, call it to the pastor, say, hey, this guy came from your church. Do you think I need to know? And maybe it might send them back for restoration, alignment, or, hey, here's the best way for you to pastor this individual. So that's why it's a kingdom deal, not just an individual church deal for accountability and discipline.
Yeah, I love that. Just that cooperation between churches, both good and
Mhm.
bad. So and by the way, I part of the reason I wanted to have this conversation with you, Brian, is I want to make sure that many of the people that listen to my podcast connect with you and understand kind of what you do in your world. And I would love for some of the listeners to even connect with you to talk about
Sure.
possibly doing one of these assessments. We just don't have time to get into all the 12 characteristics and every single one and what they mean and all of that. But let me ask you this. From the interactions that you have with churches, what do you feel like are the usual suspects, the characteristics that most often need to be addressed?
Most characteristics that need to be addressed, I would say often there is there is a failure of biblical application. If a church is really bent towards biblical application, if they do that faithfully, that's going to begin to handle a lot of other issues in the church. The reason I say that is because our churches can be built for biblical information, that I'm going to come to church and I'm just going to get smarter, biblically smarter about a given topic. Well, we know if we're going to build our life, build our church on the rock and not the sand, that's those who do the word of God. And so I found that churches that do the word of God, they're going to translate that out to the value of evangelism. They're going to make sure their finances are handled wisely. They're going to make sure that people are in a relationship, so they're spurring one another on towards loving good deeds. They're going to address just some of the administrative areas in wise ways. And they're going to make sure they're handling God's word wisely if it's about biblical application and biblical knowledge. The other part I would say is churches who are mature enough to handle small issues of health early and wisely. I had one pastor a couple of years back who called me, said, Brian, I love you. I know you're there for us, but just know this, I'm only going to probably call you if it's a 5-alarm fire. And I said, hey, appreciate that. Could you make it a 3-alarm fire? Because sometimes as I'm there happy to serve the guys in the churches, it can get, I'm called into pretty much the really difficult, heated church about to split situations, and you're having to navigate through those. But when churches are really challenged and maybe they have to make a really pivotal decision, like we'll walk through churches, do they need to replant? Is it a revitalization? Is it a campus merger? Do they need to close and sell the assets? Those are painful conversations when major adjustments are needed. But if those micro changes could be addressed years earlier, I'd say we're willing to learn, we're willing to grow. Boy, it's going to save a lot of uncomfortable heartache in the years to come. So I think that's key is none of us are perfect. We need to have a healthy habit of change. And the reason I throw that word in there is I tell our churches, there's a big theological word for change, and it's called sanctification. So we need to be in a posture of sanctification, changing from who we are right now into Christ likeness until we see Jesus. So get in that rhythm of healthy change, because that's a hard attitude of sanctification, and we need to reflect that into our entire church so that we're biblically on a journey towards church health, holy health in every single area of our church. So that's what we encourage on.
Yeah, that's great. So I feel like, Brian, there may be some guys listening that they're in a situation where their church they're struggling. Maybe they're thinking about revitalization, thinking about a relaunch, or just they know the church is not healthy, but it's hard to kind of put their finger on exactly what's going
Sure.
on. I think there's some churches that would definitely benefit from having kind of some metrics and some frameworks to go through those and characteristics. But also, I think there are some churches where pastors say, I feel like things are pretty good right now, but I want to make sure that I don't become complacent, that
Sure.
I don't allow these blind spots to continue to develop until it gets to that 5 alarm fire moment.
Right.
And I think it's a good practice to periodically, just like you would audit your finances, audit the health of your church. So, and I know you're one of many people that would do something like this, but tell us, how do you go about that? If somebody calls you and say, hey, Brian, can you come to our church? Can you kind of just do a top to bottom assessment of where we're at,
Yeah.
the bad and the ugly? What does that look like?
Sure. We call them deep dives is what I do. And based off the church, some like, hey, it's not that bad. So I just call them a shallow dive. And so when that happens, I will come in, and it takes a couple months for me to put a full report together. We're just finishing up with a couple churches now. So it ends up with about a full report, probably about 6-7 pages. And what I'll do, we have a 1-page assessment, and all these resources, they are on our website. So if you just go to pbbassociation.org, just to our equip page, you'll see a healthy church section and all these stuff. I got webinars on there, and all these documents are sitting there for free. But what we'll do, we'll come into with the church. I'll look at the demographics around the church. And so we'll pull, based off the density of the population, a 1, 3, 5 mile radius of that church, and then compare that against the church dynamic. I'll do interviews often of about 9, 10, 12 people within the church, talk to leadership. I'll look at finances of the church to be able to identify any trends, or if their budget might be a little bit out of balance. We'll also come in and I'll look at some attendance trends. Hey, we didn't think it was that big a deal because it was only 2% last year. But when you begin to put together the last 10 years, now that's actually 2% a year. Now we're off by 20%, and we didn't realize it. So we'll have to kind of expose those areas. I'll often go to look at the church facility too, to say, hey, there's some areas where pretty much, hey, if the 1980s returned, you are completely ready for it. But there might be some areas that they need to address because you're at a place so long, and sometimes you can get blind to the needs, or maybe the community has changed and they need to tweak a little bit. I'll just say this, I've been in some churches and there's just a lot of clutter and they didn't realize it. So we'll help them address some structural issues of, hey, you need a new roof, you need new air conditionings, and help them analyze what those items might be. And then when all of that assessment comes together, and I'll look at numbers, our other assessments that we have, 1-page assessment and all the interviews, I'll put together a report for our churches. And usually at the end of about 5 potential recommendations, I'll give them 2 to choose from. That's revitalization. And that is meaning we have the resources and we have the organizational, we have the structure. We just need to refocus. And so that's revitalization.
Mhm.
If they need outside resources to come in for them to accomplish wherever they need to go, that goes into a replant. That's just, hey, we need to launch a whole new church from here. That might be a campus or a satellite model. That might be a merger with another church, or in the extreme saddening conditions, if for whatever reason that church it just needs to close and let's sell those assets. Those are the worst case scenarios, but we want to analyze whatever the situation is, provide a couple recommendations based off observations, and then that church decides what do we want to do. So we don't make any decisions on behalf of any of our churches. We just analyze, observe, make some couple recommendations that we feel led to, and then the leaders, they'll determine, and then they actually are the ones that make a recommendation final to the church as to what's the best response that we need to take.
Right. That's great. And I appreciate that, because there's a lot of thoroughness, but sort of top to bottom. It's not just one issue. It's looking at the totality of everything going on, because
Right.
sometimes one issue bleeds into another. And if you're just like, hey, we just need to look at the budget. Well, yeah, but looking at the facilities probably informs the budget. Looking at the demographics informs the budget. So they're all interrelated.
They are. I mean, we've looked at, like, even last week I was at a church and I needed to help them kind of rethink through their budget. But their budget was also connected to some outreach possibilities, and they also had stuff coming from a hurricane, some finances coming in. And so when they're thinking we have these finances that came in after a hurricane, now how do we need to adjust or fix our facility? Yes, maybe adjustment in our insurance policy, but if we need to fix this area, is there a tweak in how we fix it based off the community and the people we're reaching? Because the room might have been designed, painted, crafted, whatever, for who the community was and who that church was 20 years ago. But the church and the community may have shifted since they designed that space, and it's just not appropriate, convenient. Maybe they needed to flip an adult classroom into a children's space, or vice versa. And so you want to make sure that you're kind of having everything in order. So you're not, hey, let's fix the whole facility, and then you think about the community later. Well, then you got to go back in and fix the whole thing up again.
Right.
So we're just helping kind of order some of those church decisions. And again, we're just making recommendations based off what we see, and then churches can take and run with it as they're able and feel led.
Right. That's awesome. Well, Brian, I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate you sharing some more about the association. I think it's been a really helpful conversation, and I've just enjoyed getting to know you over the last few conversations that we've had. Before we go, can you share, if people want to get in touch with you? We got pbbassociation.org. And then what about if people want to get in touch with you personally?
Yeah, you can actually do that off there. And so just if you were just to Google Pensacola Bay Baptist Association .org, of course, you'll see just the pbbassociation.org, and that'll get to all of their stuff. My contact information is there in the bottom left side of that. And so you can all email Brian at PBBA Associations. They're right there. And so, yeah, all of our contact right there, how to get a hold of me is all sitting right there on our website. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, so all of that social stuff as well. We got a YouTube channel to be able to see some of our resources out there as well. But yeah, just the easiest contact, just right through our website. Click my face or something right there is in that little drop down menu off the front page, and then it kind of takes you everywhere from there.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I certainly hope some of you, the listeners, will connect with you, Brian, because I know you got a wealth of wisdom to be able to share for a lot of churches. So, all right. Thanks again, Brian, and thanks everybody for listening. I'll see you on the next episode.